So good afternoon, everyone. Now, the talk that I'm going to present in front of you is not really my talk. It's a talk of my colleague who unfortunately could not be with us today for some personal reasons. So this is a talk which she had presented in the last cube as well, and this was about high fluorescence cells, which is a parameter which is available on the Mindray 6800 plus and 6800 analyzers. And today, there is nothing called pseudobasophilia in most of the analyzers because somehow the reagents which have been, the reagents and the chemicals that have been used, they have ensured that the pseudobasophilic area where they be picked up, they are actually picked up in now a channel which is the fluorescence cell channel, and in that the lymphocytes are picked up separately. All right, so these slides are directly from my colleague's presentation. And she has done this work on utility of high fluorescence cells, their predictive value in dengue. And of course, the entire credit for this presentation goes to her, for no doubt, and to one another thing, a living thing, and that's this mosquito. Because if the mosquito would not have been there, we would not have had the chikungunya, the malaria, and the dengue. And therefore, a lot of credit to this fellow as well. The other thing which happened of late was everybody was talking about IPF. You know, IPF suddenly became something very, very phenomenal. There was a lot of work done again by Tina and her colleagues in Handoo Hospital. And they came out with a very interesting observation that as you observe IPF going up and the platelets going down and suddenly IPF stabilizing, you realize that the platelets are going to recover. And this is history now. A lot of people have worked on it. A lot of people have taken credit for it, that this was a new parameter which they have discovered, and a lot of water has flown down Yamuna since then. Now, we have this new kid on the block, which is called the high fluorescence cell fraction, and this high fluorescence cell fraction happens to be a smarter fellow because you really do not need to send the sample into the retic mode. Now you're just running it into a routine CBC diff mode, and you get these high fluorescence cell percentages, and based on that, you have certain predictive values, which she had presented to us in her last year's presentation as well, and these are the slides from there as well. So in dengue, you have these transfusion requirements, and you want to ensure that you reduce the transfusion requirements as little as possible, and for that, you want to decode the possibility of picking out the recovery of platelets. Now, how does that help you? A small little study was done in our center where they looked at 121 patients with a positive dengue test, either NS1 or IgM, and they looked at the patients with falling platelet counts of less than 150,000. And they had certain exclusion criteria as well. For instance, if they had only IgG antibody against dengue virus was found positive, that would be excluded. And patients with positive tests for dengue, NS1 or IgM, but normal platelet counts of more than 150,000, sorry for the typo there. There was a control group as well, which was a febrile control group in which they looked at typhoid, malaria, hepatitis, and of course the ones which we could not even diagnose after a long investigative profile for more than a month and a half, and they were classified as pyrexia of unknown origin. Now, when all these cases, the analysis or the sample was run on the analyzer within first 6 hours. And fortunately, we again happened to be a hospital-based lab, so it was not very difficult for us to ensure doing that. And same was done for the control groups as well. So now what you need to notice is what happened to the high fluorescence cell peaks. Of course, I will only tell you what exactly was picked up. I'm sorry. Let me go back. So what we are seeing here is that in majority of the groups, when you look at the febrile group or the control group, the mean and the median were much, much, much lower compared to the study group, where the mean and the median were significantly higher. So this obviously gave you an insight that when you're having the study group, which is the dengue group, your mean and median for high fluorescence cells becomes much higher. And these are the high fluorescence cells which you get on this analyzer on the cube pattern. And eventually, what we proposed was that if you have a high fluorescence cells of more than 5%, in an endemic area at that particular point of time and you have thrombocytopenia, do suspect dengue and do investigate for dengue in such patients. The other point that they wanted to look at was that would it predict recovery of platelets in dengue? You know, you're now looking at two different cell lines. On one side, you're looking at the platelets, and the other side, you're talking about lymphocyte predicting a platelet. But interestingly, there was some very interesting data that we figured out. We found that we are getting, as the number of platelets start dropping, the high fluorescence cells start going up. the gray and the red. So the platelets go down and the high fluorescence cells go up, and they would, at some point of time, would be a jump from a baseline to a much higher value of the high fluorescence cells. So in this case, that's what happened, and eventually when they look at the jump of the high fluorescence cells, it was found that whenever the high fluorescence cell jump is higher, in almost 90% of the cases, the platelet recovery is going to happen within 48 hours of the jump of high fluorescence cells. And how did we define jump? So if you had a baseline value, which was like this, and there was an increase by 5 times, a baseline value of 0.9 and an increase by 4 times, or a percentage of 1 to 2 and an increase of 3 times. So this is how a jump was defined, and it actually correlated very, very well. So relationship was like this, as you have seen it previously also. You will have the platelet counts going up, and obviously the high fluorescent cells will have a jump as well. Now, what we were interested in further was to see whether after the recovery has happened, does it give us a value which is going to give us further information as to how we can take it further with respect to same-day recovery versus within 24 hours recovery and within 48 hours recovery. So a lot of them actually recovered within 24 hours, the same day, and many a times it recovered within 24 to 48 hours. The next question which we wanted to ask and answer at that point of time was, what are these high fluorescence cells? Of course, a lot of us think that they are either lymphocytes or they are monocytes, and people from the previous era would always say that they are nothing but the downy cells which we used to pick up on the morphology. But in the era of immunology, you want to know what is their phenotype, what exactly are they phenotypically. So therefore, that is the extension which was done for this year's cube. And we did a flow cytometry on 40 dengue positive patients. We took EDTA samples from them and looked at the fluorescence cells vis-a-vis the positivity for CD3, 4, 8, and 19. So idea was we look whether they are B cells or T cells, and if they are T cells, are they CD4 or CD8? I don't know how many of you have seen the literature. The literature is varied. You know, some of the people say they are B cells. There are people who say, no, there are T cells. There are others who say, no, they are neither T nor B, they are monocytes. And even on the phenotypic papers, a lot of people claim them to be monocytes. But anyways, so we looked at it and we saw what happened was, we looked at the absolute counts because the percentages did not seem to really correlate very, very well. And we looked at the absolute count of the high fluorescence cells and compared it with whatever absolute counts we started getting in various cell lines. What we observed was that it best correlated with the CD3 counts. That means the T cells. And therefore, and if you look at the 4 and the 8, the 4 and the 8 is not really altered, and it's not that we can claim at this point of time that there are only 8, because there are a lot of studies which say that there are CD8 positive T cells alone. Now this is where we stand in terms of the number of cases that we had. Of course, we had 55% cases correlating extremely well with CD3, but there was an overlap with other cell lines as well. Of course, some of them also showed CD19 positivity. So we had about 82% cases showing T cells and 17% B cells. Of course, we do have a plausible explanation as to how this works, but we'll not get into details of that because the idea was that this is what majority of the people have talked about, the cytotoxic T cells, which we have not been able to figure out in our study. The advantages of identifying high fluorescence cells vis-a-vis the platelet counts is that it is an economical test because you don't really need to run the sample in the retic mode. And of course, it does not get affected by platelet transfusions. So if I conclude, high fluorescence cells can be used as a surrogate marker for diagnosis of dengue in the sense that it can direct you to go ahead and investigate for dengue, especially in the settings of thrombocytopenia and in a season. And of course, high fluorescence cells can also be used for predicting the recovery of platelets in dengue patients. This is our team. We work in Delhi. Thank you very much for your kind attention. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.